Let's do it.
Take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this week's webinar. Tonight, we'll be talking more about the role of Oregon's state forests in the fight against climate change. My name is Alexander Harris, and I'm a forest policy consultant for Oregon Wild. I'll be facilitating tonight's webinar. We've got two solid panelists lined up for tonight's presentation. They'll be diving deeper into how our state forests are currently managed and opportunity for the state to exemplify climate smart forestry in the future. Before I go into housekeeping items and introduce the panelists, I'd like to turn it over to Chandra Legui at Oregon Wild for just a minute. Chandra?
Okay. Thank you, Alex. Again, I'm Chandra Legui. Hi, everybody. You've probably seen my face before. I'm the Western Oregon Field Coordinator for Oregon Wild, based in my basement in beautiful Eugene. For those of you who might be new to Oregon Wild, we are a statewide conservation organization dedicated to protecting and restoring Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for Oregonians. Fighting for a livable climate by protecting and restoring forests on public lands and reforming laws on state and private lands are a big part of our work. So that's why we're excited to present this evening's webinar. I'll talk more about our work for just a few minutes after our two main speakers and before Q&A, but I just wanted to say hello while Alex was kicking things off.
Thanks, Chandra. So a few housekeeping items. If your screen suddenly freezes or if the presenter's slideshow disappears, just try closing out your browser completely and then rejoining using the link that we sent you by email about an hour ago. We are recording tonight's webcast, and we'll send you an email tomorrow with the recorded video. So you can watch this later. We'll also post the video to Oregon Wild's website. We encourage you to share via Facebook and email. Many of you bought raffle tickets for tonight's webinar. We appreciate your support. The funds generated for the raffle not only help us put on presentations like this, but also support other important conservation work. Tomorrow morning, we'll be doing the drawing for the raffle, and we'll email the winners to confirm shipping addresses. So watch your email. Next week, we have another webcast that will feature a panel discussion with diverse conservation leaders in Oregon. Panelists will talk about current and historic barriers to working in natural resources conservation, efforts to dismantle racism and other obstacles, successes of environmental organizations to create a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable movement, and opportunities for more change. The RSVP page for that event is live now at OregonWild.org, and we'll also be sending you a link in tomorrow's follow-up email. All right, so with that, we do have two solid panelists speaking tonight, each for about 20 minutes. At the end of the second presentation, Chandra will talk just for a few minutes about Oregon Wild's work on this topic. Following Chandra's comments, we'll have time for a Q&A with the panelists until about 5 or 10 minutes after 7 p.m. We're not going to take too much of your time tonight, but we do want to devote some good time for Q&A at the end. You can enter your questions at any time during the presentation using the question bubble on the webcast interface. Those questions will go to me, and I will compile them to see how many we can get to. We usually don't get to all of them, but I will do my best to prioritize the questions that haven't been asked yet. Try to submit your questions at least 5 minutes before the Q&A begins. That way I'll have time to assess what questions we have and pass those along to the panelists. All right, so tonight we'll be hearing from Felice Kelly, who's a community organizer with 350 PDX, where she helps lead their new forest defense team. Felice will be providing a short primer on the forest carbon cycle, as well as a brief overview of the science on this topic. Then she'll discuss how public forest lands that are owned by the state of Oregon can be an incredible asset in the fight against climate change, not only in terms of drawing down excess carbon levels in the atmosphere, but also in helping communities and ecosystems adapt to the impacts of a warming planet. She'll be followed by Teresa Bird, who is an organizer and citizen scientist based in Port Orford, Oregon, where she works with Coast Range Forest Watch. Teresa has tracked the Elliott State Forest for many years and will be presenting about where things currently stand with Oregon State University taking over management and ownership of the Elliott. Like I said, after Teresa speaks, we'll hear from Chandra and then a short Q&A. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Felice. And we'll get your screen share set up, Felice, and you can I'll take it from there.
Yeah. And for the rest of us, if you want to turn off your webcams, you totally can do that. So that Felice is who our audience sees.
All right, can you guys see my screen all right?
Yes.
Can you?
Yes.
And you can hear me. Excellent. Proof of the pudding. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on a beautiful summer evening to learn about carbon, climate change, and the connection to Oregon's forests. My name is Felice Kelly, and I'm actually a molecular biologist by day, but I spend a lot of my free time thinking about forests. And to protect forests and a livable climate, I organize and sometimes disorganize with 350 PDX, which is a climate change and environmental justice organization, with the Great Old Broads for Wilderness, and with Oregon Wild, from whom I've learned a lot and who I want to thank for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. Before I dive in, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that tribal nations have managed the forests that we're going to discuss today for millennia. This map shows kind of some rough boundaries of where Oregon's tribal nations' traditional homelands were, and they changed over time, that they lived and worked in these forests and actively managed them with traditional ecological knowledge. So we still have a lot to learn. Tonight, as Alex mentioned, the talk will have a couple sections. I'm going to start out by talking about carbon and climate change, and then how forest management can make a real difference in the carbon fixation of the forest. I'll touch on the power of public lands to fight climate change, and finally talk about Oregon State forests and where we go from here. Of course, all of this would be a bit of a parlor exercise if we weren't in the midst of a climate emergency. As everyone's aware, we are steadily increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The chart on the left shows the observations from the Mauna Loa Observatory from 1960 until today, and you see the steady increase in global CO2 concentrations. On the right, you see the concomitant increase in global temperature, and all of the warmest years on record, the top 5 warmest years on record, have been the last 5 years. Climate change is happening now. It's affecting people, especially people who've contributed very little to it, all over the globe right now. And now is the time to marshal all of our resources to reduce emissions and to try to sequester more carbon. And that's what I'm going to talk about, the sequestration side of it today. But let's start out by thinking about carbon. When you take a look at a scene like this family walking through the forest, where is carbon here? It turns out carbon is basically everywhere. We are made of carbon-based molecules. That's why we say we have carbon-based life. Carbon is present in the grass. Carbon is present in the soil. And importantly, of course, carbon is present in the air. And carbon is in all of these different parts in different forms. So the people have macromolecules like this leucine. And in this molecule, the dark gray spheres represent carbon molecules. Leucine's an amino acid. It would be linked with other amino acids to build proteins, and those proteins make up your muscles. And other carbon-based molecules make up a lot of the rest of your tissues. Maybe you've gained a little bit of weight during the pandemic. You're really just fixing a little bit of extra carbon. Importantly for this talk, trees are also mostly made from carbon. 40 to 50% of the weight of a tree is actually carbon. And trees are made of largely of cellulose, which is shown here on the left. And again, the dark gray spheres represent the carbon atoms in this molecule. These form long chains and basically make up the structural elements of the tree. And then, of course, carbon is also present as CO2 in the atmosphere, shown over here. And when we think about the carbon cycle as a whole, carbon moves through the planetary system. So first we have to think about where carbon is stored in kind of these large pools. There's a few main pools. One pool is the fossil fuels, which are found beneath the Earth's crust. And then also the Earth's crust itself, which stores an immense amount of carbon. Above ground, we find carbon in the atmosphere, again as CO2, and in plant matter, really in all living things, but most of the carbon is stored in plants. And then there's a lot of carbon also in the ocean, but we're not really going to deal with it today. Way too complicated. When we look at those major pools of carbon, carbon moves between them in processes that we call fluxes. So one of the ones we think about a lot is that when we burn fossil fuels, they go from this major fossil fuel pool through the burning of the fossil fuels into the atmosphere, driving global warming. But there are arrows that go the other way. And one of the most important ones that we're going to think about today is photosynthesis, which pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and puts it into plant tissue. And if we take a closer look at that process, how the carbon cycle as it relates to a tree, I really think it's one of the coolest parlor tricks in nature that trees can make matter out of air. Basically, they take the CO2 from the atmosphere, the energy from the sun, water, trace nutrients from the soil, and make plant tissue. And so you can see this process in the diagram here. They make trunks, branches, leaves, the whole 9 yards. That carbon will largely remain within the tree during its lifetime. The tree obviously will have some detritus that falls off as leaf litter or branches, and that litter can either become part of the soil carbon pool or can return to the atmosphere through decomposition. And in addition, plants undergo respiration where they break down their own sugars for energy. And this process can store actually a lot of carbon. The forests of the Pacific Northwest store a globally significant amount of carbon. So if we just consider the case of Oregon, Oregon's annual CO2 emissions total 17 million metric tons of carbon. But every year, Oregon's forests sequester 10.8 million metric tons of carbon. So the forests themselves are able to sort of offset a lot of our annual emissions. Of course, given that we're in a mad planetary race against climate change, we need to work on both sides of that equation. If you look at the stores of carbon as a whole, Oregon's forests store more than 3 billion metric tons of carbon. This is a globally significant storehouse of carbon that we need to keep intact. And that brings us to thinking about how we do keep that carbon intact and how we grow that store. And the good news is that forest management really matters. Anyone who's been out to the Coast Range knows that there's a lot of industrial logging taking place, and that industrial logging emits stored carbon. It's obvious on its face. You have a lot of standing trees, which are made of carbon, and you remove them from the landscape. And if you look at the time lapse on the right, you can see that in this 16-year period shown here, there's extensive clear cutting taking place in the Coast Range at a level that we believe probably is not sustainable long-term. And you may have heard, fine, we're logging the trees, but we're storing all that carbon in wood products. Unfortunately, the process to go from a tree to a chair involves a lot of carbon loss. If you look at a live tree with 100% of its theoretical carbon in its leaves, branches, and trunk, the initial logging process already removes about 50% of the carbon stored in the tree. And that logging residue is usually burned or degrades quickly, and so that carbon is quickly returned to the atmosphere. That tree trunk then needs to be milled into product, and mill residue releases another 22% of the carbon. So already just in the process of making the chair, we've gone from the live tree at 100% of its own carbon to just 1/3 of the carbon stored in the wood product. Now, logging is also a fossil fuel intensive industry, especially as it's currently practiced. So if you consider the fossil fuels expended in logging and milling those products, that net produces another 17% of the tree's original carbon. So if you look at the net storage in this process, you only keep about 15% of the carbon that was stored in a live tree. So wood products are not a particularly good way to store carbon. In contrast, a growing forest stores a ton of carbon. And how we harvest working forests can make a really big difference towards their carbon storage. So this graph basically is a model of how different rotation lengths, which is basically how long trees are allowed to grow between harvest, how different rotation lengths affect the carbon storage of the forest. In this example, we start out with sort of a never logged forest at its peak total carbon storage. That initial harvest greatly reduces the carbon stored in the forest. But if that forest were allowed to grow back, you see it would eventually return to the old growth level of carbon storage, though it would take, basically 150 years. However, if that forest was then put on a relatively short rotation length, let's say a 50-year rotation length, you see that the carbon stored in that landscape never gets anywhere close to the carbon initially stored in the old growth forest. And it's really interesting to think a little bit more about this idea of rotation length. It's only one of a lot of variables that we could consider when thinking about how forestry might be able to better store carbon. There's an interesting study that looks at the difference between two relatively similar rotation length regimens. Doesn't change any other variables, just comparing whether you harvest the trees every 75 years or every 42 years. The cool part is these two rotations produce the same amount of lumber, but the longer rotations store more carbon, have fewer landslides, and I'm going to get to this in a minute, they keep water in the river. And I've just shown kind of with these giant trees here that the 75-year harvest will store 20% more carbon in the landscape, again, producing the same amount of total lumber. And as an auxiliary benefit, it will also keep more water on the landscape. Most Oregonians get their drinking water from a forested landscape. And recent research has shown that industrial forestry can reduce summer stream flow by 50%. But the most dramatic decrease is shortly after the logging of a stand. And so by increasing rotation length, we'll actually end up increasing the amount of drinking water available for Oregonians. And so I want to turn now to the ways in which public lands have helped us fight climate change. As everyone who follows Oregon Wild probably knows, a lot of Oregon is taken up with public lands. This map just shows in dark green the national forests, covering a lot of the state. In yellow, state forests, which we're going to talk about later. And in other colors, things that don't have that many forests, so we're not going to bother with them, except for Crater Lake National Park, which has great forests. When we look at these public lands, they are absolute carbon sponges. Today, the national forests in Oregon and Washington are accumulating carbon at a rate of 7 million metric tons per year. That's the equivalent of 24% of all of the fossil fuel emissions in both states. But even at that rate, national forests are only storing about 63% of their total carbon storage capacity. So we have room to grow that sponge as well. And once again, management makes a huge difference in how much carbon the forest stores. So many of you will know that in 1994, a major regulation was passed called the Northwest Forest Plan. And the Northwest Forest Plan was adopted in response to threats to endangered species, but it had a side benefit, a major side benefit of increasing carbon storage on public lands. So prior to the passage of the Northwest Forest Plan, both private forests and public forests were net sources of carbon, largely because there was a huge amount of old growth logging going on. Here we're just considering 1985 to 1989. After the passage of the Northwest Forest Plan, public forests began storing carbon at an incredible rate. This is, again, in million metric tons of carbon stored per hectare per year. So consider how big the public forests are. It's a ton of carbon. Of course, you'll notice right away that private forests have not approached the storage level of public forests. Again, because public forests are largely limited logging, whereas private forests undergo pretty intense industrial forestry. So we know that these federal forests are being managed in a way that allows them to soak up a huge amount of carbon. But there's sort of a forgotten pool of public lands in Oregon, and that's Oregon's state forests. So Oregon has these state forests that make up about 820,000 acres. 600,000 acres of those are controlled by the Oregon Board of Forestry, which is appointed by the Senate and makes decisions about how these forests are managed and about the regulations that govern private forestry in the state. Our state forests are managed primarily for timber production, and the revenue goes to county governments and the Common School Fund. And because of where these forests are located, in an area of low elevation and high precipitation, these forests have very high carbon storage potential. Excuse me. And right now, state forests really do provide numerous benefits. Many of you have probably hiked on the state forest. They're great trails out there. They're important habitat for endangered species, endangered and threatened species, such as salmon species, the marbled murrelet, and the northern spotted owl. Many people get out to the state forest as part of a school trip. There's a lot of educational opportunities. And then, as I've already mentioned, the state forests provide carbon storage and clean water for, I think it's 400,000 Oregonians get their drinking water from state forests. So these are really important lands to the people of Oregon. Unfortunately, current management of these lands prioritizes extraction. Analysis of the recent annual operating plans for the northwest portion of the forest, the Tillamook and Clatsop forests, shows that the state forests, the sections that are available for logging, are being logged on about a 55-year rotation. Within those logged areas, we see steep slope logging, which will potentiate landslides that endanger people and add sediment to streams. We see large clear cuts with few trees retained. And we see narrow stream buffers. And again, both of those will decrease the amount of water available to downstream communities and to endangered salmon species. These state forests are really interesting because the statute says that they need to be managed for the greatest permanent value and defines that as healthy, productive, and sustainable ecosystems that over time and across the landscape provide a full range of social, economic, and environmental benefits to the people of Oregon. Does that sound like the extractive model that we see in state forests today? We don't think so. And so one of the things that we're trying to do, especially with our 350 PDX team right now, is to think about what's next and to think about what a new vision for state forest would look like. I think in that vision, the parts of the state forest that are in good shape, that have seen the least logging or that are the most important for endangered species habitat would be retained, restored, and allowed to grow. Basically, we start now to grow some new old growth. We would also promote climate smart forestry on the parts of the state forests that are working forests, that are in a harvest regime. And importantly, it would also ensure that alternative state funding is available for logging dependent counties so that we aren't leaving those counties high and dry. And the time to make this vision happen is now. I'm sure many of you saw that this spring, Governor Brown signed an executive order on greenhouse gas emissions. She said that all agencies with jurisdiction over natural and working landscapes need to encourage carbon sequestration and storage. To us, that sounds like that's ODF's, that's a charge for the Oregon Department of Forestry. But the Oregon Department of Forestry has traditionally been managed for the production of timber. And so we think that there's some major changes that need to happen in order for Oregon's forests, especially the state forests, to realize their carbon storage potential. And there's a few things that we think we can do in the near future that'll make a big difference for state forest management and can also influence the larger regime of private forest management in Oregon. And one of the things that really interests us at 350 PDX is to put a climate scientist on the board of forestry. We think that given the importance of forests for climate change, that someone who really understands the science of climate change should be involved in making those decisions. In the same vein, we'd really like to have a climate champion as state forester. The Oregon Department of Forestry was asked to respond to the governor's executive order requiring a reduction in greenhouse gases and sequestration of carbon, and the response was incredibly weak, included no real changes to the management of state forests. And we think that that is really indicative of the fact that this management, that the current leadership isn't really ready for the climate change era. And finally, long term, we want to see a decoupling of harvest revenue from county support, because currently the regime where harvest drives county revenues sets up an automatic conflict between long-term climate health and short-term county financial health. But these are really big changes, and it's going to require a lot of grassroots pressure to make them happen. So if you're interested in learning a lot more about the state forests and how they work and how their management works, I'd urge you to please join our team, the Forest Defense Team at 350 PDX. And if you're interested, you can find a volunteer intake form on the website, and we'd love to see you at a meeting. And finally, I just want to say thank you. I've learned so much from a lot of different professionals who work in this field. I'm totally an amateur at this, and I will try my best to answer your questions, but there's a lot I'm still learning. But I appreciate all of the professionals that have really taught me, even what I know so far, and what I really look forward to learning more. Thank you.
Thanks, Felice. That was awesome. Folks, if you'd like to type in a question or two, feel free to enter your questions now as we are getting Teresa's presentation set up. Felice and Teresa will field questions at the end of the presentation. And Teresa, whenever you get that set up, you can take it away.
Felice, if you would like to turn off your camera, you can.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm going to give an Elliott update and some background for those of you who might not be familiar with what's been going on the Elliott State Forest. I work with a group called Coast Range Forest Watch. We are based down in Coos and Curry counties and primarily do community science and community education, and most of our community science has focused on the Elliott State Forest. We do surveys for the endangered marbled murrelet, which is right here. It is a really cute little seabird that lays its eggs in old growth forests. And so this is a picture looking down at a murrelet nest in a branch. And every day it has to travel back and forth from the ocean after its chick hatch to get fish and bring them back to the fuzzy little guys in the trees. And they do this several times a day. So having really big old trees close to the ocean is very important for their breeding success. And that is why the Elliott is so important for these birds. There just happens to be a lot of these big trees with these big branches for them to lay their eggs. And this is what our group has been working on since about 2013, is looking for their habitat so that we can advocate for it to be protected. And here's another picture of one of those big mossy branches from murrelets. And
hang on 1 second, Teresa.
Yeah.
Hang on one second. We can't see your screen. Okay,
Oh,
I think you might need to
I
share
wish
it
you had.
again.
Can you see it now?
I see just the background.
Your desktop.
Weird.
Can't see your presentation.
Oh, I know what happened. Okay, hang on.
Oh,
Aha.
Can you see it now?
yes.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, I'm using a dual screen thing here. Okay, I'll show you the couple of pictures I passed through while I was talking. Here is a marble merlet. Can you see that?
Yes. So cute.
Great. So cute. Yeah, and here's the nest that it lays and that it makes in the mossy branches. Here is the bird taking its little fish to the chick that you see on the right, kind of fuzzy little thing in the corner. And this is the screen I was on right before you told me I was talking without you, sorry. Yeah, this is a picture from the Elliott on the left, someone measuring a really large tree, and then the merlet egg on the right in that mossy branch. And so here is a map of the Elliott State Forest showing just how many of these areas there are that are really great for merlets, like that branch you see in the picture. And just for some context geographically, you probably saw this on the last presentation, but here's the Elliott State Forest in this yellow blob. It's between Coos Bay and Reedsport. And on the right here, for context, historically, you can see this is that area where this map shows native languages, and the Elliott State Forest before it was the Elliott was used by several native tribes for lots of different reasons. And it was it was territory that was never ceded to U.S. government, but nevertheless, when Oregon became a state, there was a lot of different lands claimed for different purposes, and one of those was the Common School Fund you heard mentioned not that long ago, which was land set aside to make money for a public school system, and these are owned by the Department of State Lands. They were scattered all around the state, and a lot of them were sold off. There's some still in eastern Oregon and some other scattered parcels, but a lot of them were consolidated into the Elliott State Forest. And these lands are governed by the State Land Board, which is always made up of the governor, treasurer, and the Secretary of State. And this is important to know because, for one, these are the people that make decisions about the Elliott. And two, a lot of controversy about the Elliott has revolved around the Common School Fund. Because, you know, does the Elliott's main purpose need to be making money for schools? And this title here, this is what the Constitution of Oregon says about Common School Fund lands and the Elliott, that it's to be managed for the greatest benefit of the people of the state of Oregon. And so, and not necessarily just for revenue, but historically, since it became the Elliott, it was managed for timber harvest to provide revenue. And then at some point, this level of harvest became unsustainable and also illegal. They were logging endangered species habitat and were sued over it and lost the lawsuit, the state did, and this caused obviously a loss of revenue. And so they tried to right this by selling off some parts of the Elliott, which also turned out to be illegal. And for some reason, since that went so well, they decided to sell the whole forest. And this led to public outcry from all sectors, really, because for one, it's the loss of a great asset and the privatization of public lands, and then also the loss of really great conservation values and habitat values, ecosystem services, if it were to be sold to a private timber company. And so that brings us to where we are today. The Land Board decided to finally get a little creative and try to think about a solution that could satisfy multiple values. And that's why they're talking about the Oregon State University potentially taking on management of the Elliott and having it be a research forest. And so to do this, the Land Board directed that there be a habitat conservation plan put in place, so ensuring that there would be habitat for marbled murrelet, northern spotted owl, and coho salmon, which are the 3 federally endangered species that are on the Elliott. And then they also made an Elliott Advisory Committee, which is made up of stakeholders. So that includes tribal representatives, county commissioners, timber industry, conservation groups, school board. And that's to advise the process and I think preempt some big conflicts like they've dealt with in the past. And so OSU's excited about this idea of getting a world-class research forest basically for free. And so they've put out some proposals of what they want to do. They'd like to establish a constant research platform where the Elliott will be managed the same way for 100 years so they can do their research. And they want to divide the Elliott into watersheds and have the watersheds managed in different ways. And there's 3 different types of management they're talking about. The first one is reserve, so managed for habitat conservation values. The second is intensive management, and so that looks a lot like your industrial style. 100% of the volume is harvested. And then extensive management would be about half of the volume is harvested, so like an ecological forestry style. And the picture on the right shows an example of one watershed in the Elliott where some of them are designated one of these 3 different types of management, but some, like this picture, are divided up into all of them. And so it's kind of complicated to see, but just for an example of one conversation we've been having with OSU in this process, this green area on the map is representing basically clear-cut type logging, and this crosshatch going to the right is marbled murrelet or spotted owl habitat. And so this is one situation where we've said, hey, let's remedy this and make sure that we're protecting the right values. And just to see what this looks like across the forest, this green on the west side is a large conservation reserve that they would like to establish for habitat values. And then the watersheds on the right are for management of all 3 different kinds of management regimes they're talking about. And just for some context, the map on the left shows where the old forest is on the Elliott, and the darker red is older, the lighter yellow is more around 100 years old. And so you can see that old, mature and old growth forest is all over the Elliott, which is what makes management complicated. And in addition, the Elliott's known for being really steep. It has about 150 miles of fish-bearing streams, and then at least that many more non-fish-bearing, and then the tributaries and headwaters. This picture, you can see several drainages that are steep going down into a larger drainage, and so that presents more challenges. And so far, Oregon State University has proposed better riparian management than the Oregon Forest Practices Act, which is great. And we're still advocating for them to clearly define what their goals are for management in these areas, what it will look like, and how specifically they will ensure they can manage for the success of the coho in the Elliott. Some other outstanding issues. Here's a little picture of a murrelet chick there. We've been advocating for the protection of all the native forests on the Elliott, and that's currently not part of the proposal. There's still some native forests and older forests that would be open to logging in OSU's current plan. We've also been advocating for no logging of endangered species habitat, and that is also one thing that is part of their current proposal. And of course, the intensive style management that you heard talked about in the previous presentation as well is currently part of the plan, and there's a lot of cumulative effects from this. Particularly aerial spraying is one that our group is working on in other areas, and is advocating for that to not be used at all in the Elliott, as well as any kind of animal control. And lastly, sort of tying this into what this night's presentations are about, is we'd like to see research and management for climate change as central to the design of the Elliott's management, and not just one research project or one part of it. And these are the things that our group has been advocating for in discussions with OSU, and we're working with other conservation groups locally here on the coast and statewide, and hoping to see some improvement on these issues before the final plan. But some other outstanding kind of questions besides those conservation related ones is that, oops, let me just get this all up. We don't know yet still who is going to hold the title. So is it going to stay with the state? Will it be transferred to OSU? If it is transferred to OSU, how will we ensure that there is the same kind of accountability to the public and transparency in the way that they're managing? And then, does the state need to have a way to pay out the Common School Fund for the loss of the Elliott if any revenue goes to the research and not to the Common School Fund? So those are some big questions that we don't know the answer to yet. No one really does, and would need to be figured out before any decisions made. And then the process, kind of going forward, the State Land Board will at some point, when all of these things are ironed out, need to make a decision, do we go forward with this or not? And that meeting is supposed to happen this winter. And then in conjunction with that, there needs to be a habitat conservation plan that's developed and then approved by U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And that goes through the NEPA process, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a federal process and of involving the public. And so what that means for you is that all those points along the way in this process, you could submit comments, and even before the State Land Board meeting, OSU is supposed to announce a time the public can send comments to them and to the Department of State Land. So really kind of the best thing to do is make sure you're signed up for a newsletter or social media or some way to find out from the conservation groups who are working on this when you can get involved and how. And I would like to, before I end, bring it back to what I see as sort of the most important parts of this to remember is that these lands are supposed to be managed for the greatest public benefit. So what are some of those other things besides what we've already talked about? A report done by EcoTrust back in 2011 showed that if the Elliott was just left alone and not managed at all, in 30 years, it would store enough carbon to offset almost 70% of the entire state of Oregon's emissions, which is like, wow, we don't have to do anything and it's providing so much. Also, 1 in every 5 of Oregon Coast coho that are sampled are found to spawn in the Elliott, which is another wow thing for being such a small part of the Oregon coast. Over half of the Elliott is old growth or untouched, unlogged native forest, compared to a lot less of that throughout the Coast Range. And then it provides public access for people who live in the area to forage and hunt and fish and recreate, which if you live down in this area, a lot of, especially around Coos Bay, it's other than that, it's private land, and you have to, say, buy a permit from the timber company to go on their lands and hunt if you wanted to be able to do that. And so these are the things we want to see valued on the Elliott, and we're hoping that that OSU could be an option who would see all these great public values and not just the opportunity to make some revenue and do some research, and that it can all be incorporated into the management plan. So I'm going to end with a picture that the Oregon State University research project took of a marbled murrelet on its nest, and this is an ongoing research project, and just to show that, we are hopeful that there's going to be opportunities for some good things to happen with this partnership, and there's just a lot left to be seen. So we'll be following this process as it continues. If you'd like to be on our newsletter, we send it out quarterly with updates. Just send us an email at coastrangeforestwatch@gmail.com, and that's up there on the screen if you'd like to write it down, and you can also send any questions you might have. And that's all.
Teresa, thank you so much for that update. That was great. I think a lot of us have paid attention to the Elliott in the past, but it's been kind of unclear where things are at. So that was super helpful. Chandra, you want to take it from here for a few minutes, then we'll turn it over to Q&A?
Yes. 1 second. Okay, can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes, and I want to make one more plug for questions. I've gotten maybe close to 20 questions so far, which are it's great. Send questions now if you have them. Otherwise, it might be too late. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Again, I'm Chandra Legui, Oregon Wild's Western Oregon Field Coordinator, and a huge forest lover. So this was really great to see hear from Felice and Teresa about their work, and it's so wonderful to have great partners in the work that I do at Oregon Wild in groups like 350 PDX and Great Old Broads and Coast Range Forest Watch. We're really all in it together here fighting for our forests. So thank you guys so much. So Oregon Wild's been around for nearly 50 years, and in that time we've seen industrial logging continue to decimate our forest ecosystems on not just our national forests, but also state lands and corporate lands. And we have seen and fought for some important and positive changes, especially on the federal public land side, as illustrated by Felice's graph about what happened when the Northwest Forest Plan took effect and our national forests changed from being a net source of carbon emissions to a sink. But with our current climate crisis, the continued decline of endangered species that rely on forests, communities put at risk from clear cuts and chemicals, there's still a lot of work to do to protect what we all love. So that's what I'm trying to show in these pictures, just some more things that we all love. And clearly, business as usual will not solve the climate crisis that we're in, protect our vital water resources, recreation, or wildlife habitat. This shows business as usual. This is a small section of the Northern Oregon Coast Range dominated by industrial corporate timberland and the clear cuts that occurred just in the last 15 years. So it's pretty dramatic and causes, a lot of problems, not just for the climate, but for all these other things as well. So a few years ago, Oregon Wild, thanks to Alex, when Alex worked full-time for Oregon Wild, put together this report that lays out what we think are the most important things we can do to defend both forests and the climate. So these are, some of Oregon Wild's top priorities. We, on public lands, we need to both maintain protections for public forests, as well as add additional protections. We need to put an end to logging of all of our ancient forests that have never been logged. And we need to reduce logging on public lands so they can better store carbon, as well as fulfill all these other values. That one can support our ecosystems better and mitigate climate change. On private and state lands, like those we're talking about tonight, we desperately need to reform our forest laws to better protect streams, wildlife, and our communities. And as part of that, we need owners of those forests to adopt climate-smart practices that will leave more trees, protect streams, and promote biodiversity on these lands. We're working on all of this, and fortunately, many other grassroots, local, regional, and national groups are also working to include forests as more of a part of a climate solution. There's great partnerships going on around the country right now and this region as well, which the speakers you heard from tonight are also a part of, which is really exciting. I just want to show you a quick illustration of some of the carbon storing potential of our forest lands that pertain to a particular area that we're talking about. This map shows in darker green, areas that are storing more carbon. And outlined in purple here is the recently protected Devil's Staircase Wilderness area, just north of the Umpqua River. So you can see there's a lot of dark green there. This is a forest that is never been logged, is in the age range of 100 to 400 years old throughout much of it. And just south of that Devil's Staircase Wilderness, south of the Umpqua River, where you see other dark green areas, that's the Elliott State Forest, and the areas that have not been logged there, that the native forests. All of the white and sort of light colored around these areas are those that have been logged and continue to be logged in an industrial fashion and aren't storing much carbon. So just hopefully that is a good illustration for you all. As shown by, hopefully many of you have seen some of the recent stories by the Oregonian, OPB, and ProPublica that have highlighted the impacts of corporate profits and the harm that they do to local communities, our ecosystems. The timber industry has a lot of power and money to mislead the public and lobby in support of business as usual. So we're up against kind of a lot when we're talking about creating change on both these private lands and state lands. But luckily, there is still a lot that we can do. We can, just for example, support forest law reform in a variety of ways. Oregon Wild and many other groups are part of the Forest Waters Coalition that's working to reform some of the forest practices that are really harmful to the climate, as well as all this other stuff. We can all help defend public lands from old growth logging. There's a lot of ways of doing that, from monitoring timber sales and writing comments about what's happening on our public lands, to weighing in on maintaining protections for old growth. And Oregon Wild sent an alert just today, actually, about a rule change for Eastern Oregon's forests that could endanger some of our old growth. So we try to offer folks ways to weigh in on that. Felice talked a little bit about the governor's executive order to reduce carbon emissions, and there's ways that the public can work to hold the Oregon Department of Forestry accountable to that executive order, and we can work towards some change that Felice mentioned about who's overseeing ODF. Things like decoupling logging revenue from county support as well, really important stuff. We can all be educating our friends and neighbors about these important issues, sharing information, about when an opportunity to weigh in on the Elliott State Forest Plan, for example, comes up. And then, of course, we can all support grassroots activists and groups who are doing this work, and I hope that you all will join me in doing that. Not just Oregon Wild, but all these other groups who are doing such amazing things. So I will leave it at that, and thank you. I will stop sharing my screen and get everybody else back on here for the Q&A portion.
Yes, thank you so much, Chandra. We got a lot of awesome questions. I just had to copy and paste them and organize. A lot of folks actually asked some of the same questions, which is exciting. The first is going to be for Teresa on the Elliott. Several people were wondering about how the pandemic is going to interact with the financial outlooks for the Elliott State Forest. There's a big budget shortfall the state of Oregon is facing because of the pandemic. How much money is the Elliott currently generating for the Common School Fund, and how will the pandemic affect our ability to save the Elliott from being potentially privatized in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Right now, the Elliott is making nothing for the Common School Fund. It's not being managed for timber really at all. And so, the pandemic, in my view, then doesn't change that, because it hasn't really made any revenue for quite some time. And so really anything that OSU is talking about doing would have some revenue benefits. The Common School Fund buyout is still an open question, I mentioned. So the legislature has already approved $100 million of bonding money to be used to help pay out the Common School Fund. But even if that takes a longer amount of time because of effects of the pandemic, it's not going to be, the Elliott's not doing anything for us right now as far as money goes. And so it's not going to cause any losses, basically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. If anything, this deal with OSU might actually get it to a point where it could be generating revenue again, right? To get through this process. And so the next question, there were several questions about climate smart logging. And I wanted to pass this to Felice, but also Teresa, if you had a way of responding. Some of the questions, I'll just read a few of them. How do you define climate smart logging? Is it possible to balance timber production with carbon storage and other forest benefits? Felice?
You're getting into a whole field of study, to be honest. So we're not going to touch on all of it tonight. There's good consensus around the fact that, as I mentioned in a couple of slides, that longer rotations do help store more carbon while potentially generating the same amount of timber, potentially even more timber, depending on the rotation setup. In addition, there's really great evidence supporting leaving wider riparian buffers, so making sure that streams are buffered to protect aquatic species that also stores a bunch of carbon. And potentially, if it's done, potentially it doesn't involve giving up that much in the way of total wood products. But there's a lot of study as far as different regimes of how to actually do the silviculture side of it. And I think it's honestly still an evolving field. I don't know if you have anything to add, Teresa or Alex.
Teresa?
Oh, that was a good answer.
Yeah, I might add just that longer rotations is definitely a part of it, but just leaving more trees on the landscape as well. So maybe not doing the clear cutting, over pretty large areas that we see today. So just leaving more trees means more carbon, less soil disturbance, because there's carbon stored in the soil as well. And plus it's good for things like wildlife.
Totally. I think that's what I hear a lot of academics and foresters who are a part of this movement, the climate smart forestry movement. A lot of them talk about how there are so many co-benefits that come with managing for longer rotations and wider buffers around streams. It's not just protecting water, it's not just protecting wildlife habitat, it's also protecting carbon storage and recreation and all these other benefits that forests provide. So there is a way to find that niche where you're still producing timber products while simultaneously managing for other values. And really what people, Sandra?
Yeah, if I could just jump in with an example of on our national forest, the Siuslaw National Forest, which surrounds, the Elliott, or just to the north of the Elliott, has been doing that for a long time, in part because they have to under the Northwest Forestland. And they weren't necessarily thinking about it from a climate perspective, but now could be thinking about that and has climate benefits, certainly. But they've been, taking out trees from plantations that were clear cut in the past, not going into the older stands and logging the old forests, and actually working to restore habitat structures and diversity in the forests for wildlife, for salmon, et cetera. So they've been doing that a long time, and it's great that that's public land, because it's preserving some of these other public values. And I think state forests are a really logical place for that to start happening outside of our national forests. Private lands may have a longer way to go because they're managed more specifically for profit, but state public lands would be a great illustration of where to really show how it could be done on state lands.
That's a great point. There were, I think, 2 different questions that were asking about the job creation potential of climate smart forestry, how that potentially could be tied to the Green New Deal, how we can both act on climate change as well as stimulate rural economies. Teresa or Felice or Chandra, do any of you have anything to say about that?
I can weigh in on that a little bit. I think it's really important to emphasize that if we change the forestry regime, there's still going to be jobs in the woods. And a lot of the job loss on private forestry, the board feet produced remained fairly constant, while the jobs have decreased as increased automation takes a lot of the jobs that people think of as like traditional, what a logger does. And the automation associated with clear-cut logging is actually quite easy. That you can run large machines to take down trees in a big area without leaving anything behind, without needing to use very many people's hands. So as we transition to a kind of forestry that might involve more hands-on management, that's not as easily run by large tractor, basically with buncher fellers, that may in itself be a job creation program. And I think also while we think about the Green New Deal and moving towards climate smart forestry, there's a lot of things that are on the table. People have talked quite a bit about whether carbon credits could be part of how long-term we could support carbon storage and revenue for these lands. And if we had that kind of money coming in, there'd be some great jobs. If I had a magic wand, I'd love to have people doing stream restoration, doing a bunch of native forest restoration. There are some thinning that needs to be done in these plantation forests. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think some of it is political, trying to figure out how to get the funds to do it and how to support the job corps that would make that happen.
Mr. Chandra, anything to add to that? Yeah, that was a great response, Felice. Glad this is being recorded because you nailed it. Watch that response. So we want to wrap up soon. I think we have time for perhaps one more question, and it'd be great to maybe get 3 of you to respond. There were 2 different questions about how we can support this work. Sometimes it's easy to identify the needs, and then it's less clear how grassroots activists and community organizations can support this work. So could each of you identify how grassroots advocates can support the work on the Elliott and the work that 350 PDX is doing on state forestry? How can we bring the state to the next step in this process of engaging in climate smart forestry?
Well, I'll just start with, for the Elliott process, I really would encourage you to sign up for our newsletter because at some point, no matter what is decided by OSU or their advisory committee, the state land board has to decide what happens, and they are subject to the public. They have to, they're public servants. They're the elected officials, and so that's what's been able to sway decisions in the Elliott in the past, is having people come to meetings and submit comments. And it's made a huge difference, and even social media pressure. And so I really would encourage you to be willing to do that. It's not always the most fun to attend a meeting, especially if it's going to be virtual. But if you would stay tuned and show up when the time comes, it'd be really, really great.
Felice, and then Chandra, you want to close us out?
Yeah, I would really encourage people to go visit forests. There's a quote that's attributed to a famous river runner that we will only save what we love, and we will only love what we know. And so getting out in the state forests and seeing it's a place of real contrast. You have spots that are in these reserves that are beautiful forests full of berries and birds. They're amazing. And then you have some really pretty gnarly clear cuts that you don't have to know a lot to be like, oh, wow, that's very steep. That's a lot of trees gone. And so I think that's a big part of it. And then, of course, all of our politicians are balancing priorities. So you have to let them know that forest management and climate change are priorities to you, so that they can like manage to get up to this like level of awareness where stuff actually happens. Huge grassroots pressure kept the Elliott from getting logged, basically, and huge grassroots pressure kind of pushed the governor to do the executive order. And then we have to say, okay, great, you did this order. What now? What does it mean? Give it teeth. So I think, like Teresa said, some of the best ways to do that is to get hooked into the knowledge base that a lot of these organizations have. Sign up for a bunch of newsletters, read them when you can, and put your elected officials' phone numbers in your address book.
Yes, just put them in contacts on your phone. It's so easy. Yes, I would
And
highly
then you can be so annoying so easily.
exactly. Chandra, you want to close this out?
Just to say thank you again, Alex, for facilitating, Teresa and Felice for adding all your knowledge and for all your hard work. I know that it's, it's my job to advocate for forests, and it's a pleasure, but it's so important that people who really care about forests, who don't, have the privilege of being paid to do so, are sharing their stories and all of their knowledge. So just thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This will be recorded. We'll send it around. So stay tuned for that follow-up, and please share the video.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Have a good night.
Night.